let's talk about Catholic annulments. They're not just Catholic divorces. I know a lot of people say, oh, you can get a divorce through the legal system, civil divorce, and then the Catholic Church just decides if you can get a divorce or not. That's not what an annulment is in the church. In the church, the Catholic Church, it identifies and recognizes a marriage as a sacrament. And it takes it very seriously. So as long as a couple enters into a marriage validly in the right, they're not previously married, they're not lying, they're not committing fraud, they're going in freely, understanding that that's what they are accepting in their life as their vocation, marriage, then the Catholic Church takes it very seriously and makes sure that your marriage is truly valid. And what an annulment is it looks at that marriage and can decide, was that a valid sacramental marriage or not? And a lot of people think, oh, an annulment is just a Catholic divorce. Well, just because you can civilly divorce your husband doesn't mean that the church guarantees an annulment. In fact, it really shouldn't guarantee an annulment at all, right? Because civilly, you can divorce for any reason. You don't even need a reason. You can just get a divorce, right? But in the church, there's no reason to get a divorce unless the marriage itself was invalid. It was null and void to begin with. So yes, there are situations where you might need to be separated from your spouse, right? If someone's being abusive, harmful, doing drugs, your kids are lives are at stake or they're in danger, there might be reasons, verbal, mental, physical abuse reasons to get out of that relationship. But the church does its best to still ensure that that is a marriage between husband and wife. And the whole goal is to bring them back together, whether that's through therapy or some sort of, reconciliation or counseling, whatever it is. If it's an affair, can you guys work through it? The whole goal is to maintain the marriage, right? And if it was a valid marriage, it must be maintained. Now, there are times where maybe you can't go back to your spouse, right? He was physically abusive. The church doesn't expect you to go back to that spouse. However, there may be a situation where your marriage was valid and the church says you're not able to remarry. And I know if you're not in the Catholic Church, that sounds unfair, but there are crosses that we all bear, and I couldn't imagine bearing that kind of cross, knowing that I'm not able to remarry and keep my salvation, because marriage, remarriage without an annulment, saying I was never married to begin with, is adultery, right? A man who leaves his wife and is with another or marries another commits adultery. Jesus Christ says this. This is not some read between the lines kind of thing in the Bible or tradition that people don't just follow because it's the Catholic Church. Jesus literally says, if a man leaves his wife and marries another, he commits adultery and makes her commit adultery, which means that we have to take this very seriously. If they are married, truly married in a valid marriage, they can't just not be married anymore. And in the Catholic Church, we believe that. We say, okay, you can have your civil divorce, but that doesn't mean that it's recognized by God, right? What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, right? Let no man separate. Doesn't matter if the civil world says it's okay. God has to decide, and God created a church. Jesus created a church on Peter, and through that church, we follow his teaching. So if you were validly married, we can't break that. And the church recognizes that. And as hard as that can be for someone who wants that annulment and wants to get remarried and find someone new, the answer might be no. And I mentioned in a previous video that my brother-in-law and his now significant other, they got married outside of the church. She was previously married as a Catholic in the Catholic Church and never sought an annulment. And she married my brother-in-law, who is also a Catholic, but they decided not to get the annulment and get married outside of the church. And one of my things was, please get the annulment so we can go to the wedding. But the other thing is, she didn't even want to seek an annulment, which made me question two things. One, her faith. Does she just not think that the Catholic Church has any right to tell her, about her marriage at all, which is sad to me because she was married in the church and she is Catholic, her family is Catholic. So to not recognize the Catholic Church's authority on that and decision on that is sad. That means she's lost her faith in that. And two, maybe she knows that her marriage is valid and it will be denied. I think one of the problems today is most people who go for annulments are granted the annulment, which is probably why a lot of people think, oh, it's just a prolonged Catholic divorce, right? It takes a few months or a few years for the church to finally say, yep, you can get remarried, right? Check. I think like 95% of annulments may not actually qualify for annulments, but I don't want to speak ill of the church and the magisterium that does it. I just question sometimes we're trying so hard to find a reason to invalidate the marriage. And I think that probably most of the time at the moment of the wedding, maybe not, 10 years later, but the moment of the wedding, it was valid. You got married in the church, you were Catholic, you promised to raise your children Catholic, you were free to marry, you meet all the qualifications to be married. Which means that if you ever go for an annulment, I would think that most of them would be denied. I just saw a segment on Megyn Kelly where she had Bishop Barron on, and she was talking about how she's been married to her second husband for the last 14 or so years, I think she said. And she's having kind of a crisis of faith because she's been trying to get an annulment from her first marriage, and it's not working out. And in the same breath, she said, I was married to him. He was my first husband. We're still really great friends. He's a really great guy. It just didn't work out. And in that case, in my head, my first thought was, oh, she wasn't even eligible to have an annulment. Like it was a valid marriage. She just left the marriage because it just didn't work out. And so she may never get an annulment. And right now she's struggling with her faith because she's never going to get an annulment, and she's already remarried. But it's not a valid marriage, and it will never be a valid marriage until she gets her first one annulled and then the second one validated in the church. Now, are there reasons where I can, as a lay person, see very clearly that it probably meets criteria for annulment? Yes. I mean, if you get married outside of the Catholic Church and you are Catholic, it automatically is invalid. So I have family where the man met a woman who was previously married, and now they are married and are seeking the annulment because they're coming into the church. And she was raised Catholic and got married outside of the church. So the church automatically says that's an invalid marriage. You were Catholic, you should have been married in the church. It took like several weeks, and it was like done, annulled. Super easy. They have to validate their marriage. Easy. Another one might be you have two Protestants that got married outside of the Catholic Church, because why would they get married in a church if they're Protestant? And I'm speaking from personal experience with a very close family member of mine. He got married for the right reasons and found out within months of the wedding that she never wanted to be married. She just wanted a party. And she told him that after the wedding. And so he met someone in my family after he got his divorce who is Catholic. And she said, well, we can't get married unless you get an annulment. And so he went through the annulment process. It took longer for them to investigate. They have to call witnesses. They have to ask what happened. And all of the witnesses said, yeah, she admitted she didn't even want to be married. She just wanted a party. Well, that's not a reason to get married, and that's fraud, right? So it took a little bit longer for them to investigate. But in the end, he got an annulment. They also, were not open to life during their very short, brief marriage. So that right there is against Catholic teaching as well. The people who are harder would be like my husband and I, and thankfully we're in a sacramental, very happy, wonderful marriage. But people like my marriage, I would hope and pray that the magisterium would never annul it, because we were married in the Catholic Church, practicing Catholics, following the faith, following the, open to life and love you till death do us part. We took our vows full well knowing what we were going through. And I think a lot of people do that without the intention of, down the road, they just didn't work out. And then they leave. And then they find out, oh, I can't get this annulled in the church. I thought we could just annul any relationship. No, you can't annul any marriage. Most marriages, especially in the church, should not even get to the annulment place, right? So people talk about annulments like they're Catholic divorces, but they're not. They are just simply making sure, was the marriage even valid to begin with? And it wasn't, then it was null and void. You're free to marry someone else, right? But if it was a sacramental valid marriage, you may never be granted the annulment at all. And that's something that we as Catholics have to accept. And we know this. We should know this. This should be in like pre-canon classes and marriage prep classes, that you can't just get a divorce and then seek an annulment. This is for life. That's what marriage is. It's for life. It's a sacrament. Jesus has his bride, the church, just as my husband has me, his bride, forever, right? So annulments are really tricky. They're hard because they come into the family and people have different ideas of what annulment means and how they recognize it. And it's just hard. I get it. But annulments are meant to protect marriage. That's the entire point, right? If marriage is valid, it will always be valid. And the church doesn't have the authority to say otherwise. It only has the authority to decide whether or not it was valid to begin with. If you like this information, like and subscribe to my channel, and have a great day.